I'd like to ask just a very few questions. This is John Sauer, representing defendant intervener Eric Russell. You made a reference to somebody called Rick Sander. And when you were referring to him, were you referring to Professor Rick Sander of UCLA Law School?
That's correct. His work is limited thus far to law schools, and his conclusion is that race preferences are harmful because of the mismatch factor that is created with students who are essentially assigned to one campus and they're not able to compete at that campus and don't pass the bar and therefore don't go to work for the major law firms, but that's the work that I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm. And is it your understanding of that work or that empirical analysis that some of, based on this mismatch effect, some of the negative effects of these racial preference programs include minority underperformance in law school?
Yes.
And is it your understanding that these negative effects also include lower minority graduation rates from law school?
Yes, and that was the result, by the way, of race preferences at the University of California. There was a significant retention gap with respect to underrepresented minorities and Asians and whites. Significant gap in graduation rates. And yet in the aftermath of Proposition 209 at UC San Diego, for example, the graduation rate among blacks has doubled. And the retention rate the gap is narrowing to some extent, and the graduation rate in the overall system, that gap is narrowing as well.
Mm-hmm.
These very issues came up in the debate between the Thurnstroms and Derek Bach and Bill Bowen in Shape of the River. Isn't that true?
That is true.
And wasn't it didn't they document, Derek Bach and Bill Bowen in Shape of the River, document that the more selective school you went to, the higher chance you had of graduating if you were a black student without regard to your SAT scores?
But the Thurnstroms disagreed with that in many respects.
They did. But they didn't have anything like the quantitative data that Bach and Bowen had, did they?
There weren't as many pages in the Thurnstroms' work as there were in the Shape of the River.
The Thurnstroms contended that only 50% of black students who went to a four-year college graduated. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
And Derek Bach and William Bowen looked at that figure and they said, well, that's true. If you're a black student who goes to a NCAA school that is a non-selective school, you only have a 30 or 40% of chance of graduating. Isn't that true?
That's true.
But if you were a black student and you went to a highly selective school, like Harvard or Yale or University of Michigan, you had a significantly higher chance of graduating. In fact, 70 or 80%. Isn't that true?
I believe that is.
And so black students that were the beneficiaries of that went to these highly selective schools benefited from being at those very selective schools, didn't they?
I believe they did.
And in fact, black students that went to highly selective schools graduated, Bach and Bowen said, at higher rates than even white students that went to non-selective schools. Isn't that true?
Yes, but this does not discount Rick Sanders' work.
Okay, but Mr. Sanders is saying that that the graduation rates for black students that went to highly selective law schools is low, but in fact, looking at the longitudinal study that Bowen and Bach did, it showed exactly the opposite. Looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of graduates, it showed that you had the best chance of passing the bar exam if you went to a highly selective law school, didn't it?
All of which goes to prove that scholars will disagree.
And in terms of minority students themselves, Mr. Sanders, he didn't bother to interview large numbers of minority students, did he?
I can't speak to that. I don't know what he did.
You read his study.
I read the study.
You don't remember any of that, do you? Any
I don't
interviews?
remember any interviews, but I can't assert that unequivocally.
Okay. Whereas in the Bach and Bowen studies, they talked to a number of black graduates, and they said that they were very, very glad to have gone to those schools, didn't they?
That's my recollection, too.
They didn't complain about feeling inferior or underperforming, did they?
If you know.
I don't recall that.
Yeah. They didn't say, oh, I wish I had gone to a school that matched my SAT scores or my LSAT scores. And they didn't say that because they knew that if they had gone to such a school, they would have had less of a chance of graduating. Isn't that true?
I don't know what they would have objected to or thought or whatever. I don't know.
It's worth asking the black students that graduated, isn't it?
Maybe, maybe not. It's really a statement on your part, isn't it?
Why wouldn't it be worth asking them, Mr. Connerly?
It doesn't, to me, it's irrelevant. Preferences are wrong. Preferences are wrong. And as I said just a moment ago, the effects of this approach or that approach are secondary to whether we believe as a society whether our citizens should be treated equally without regard to race, which is what the 1964 Civil Rights Act commands, or whether we want to avoid that act.